in prior lives, I think when we ran into challenges around security and compliance in the context of innovation, very often it's because you don't have the right people at the table, right? And those projects start out as technology projects without enough context of, what folks need to be aware of. So in our world, we are being very cognizant of that. I think all of these innovation projects bring cross-functional partners to the table from the outset. But what we do is we create an isolation, right? You can't turn it loose into the wild from day one. So we start with a very, very isolated group of here's an innovation. This is a recognized innovation pipeline that's very segmented from everything else. And allow the teams to experiment and learn and so forth through that process. And in that process, they're learning about the solutions, but they're learning about the security and the compliance and so on that needs to be hardened, right? And only when we get to a point of maturity where we go, this is now ready to be turned into the wild, then you look at the industrialization side of it. And so it's not as precise as what I just described, right? And we're still sort of learning as we go, but for us, that seems to have worked pretty effectively.
I do a lot of leadership development and mentoring for CIOs and people aspiring to be CIOs. And this is a principal concern that those folks have now, right? So there's this dual pressure. On one side, it's innovate and digitalize me. And on the other side, next day out of the other side of the mouth, it's keep the costs down and keep me secure. And these two sides necessarily conflict, right? You can't possibly innovate without spending money. Innovation implies experimentation. Experiments fail, they cost money. You can't possibly digitalize without expanding the cybersecurity threat landscape. It's impossible. So how do you balance? So this is the CIO job now. It's not about being the smartest cloud guy in the room. It's about how do you tap dance around those two, and that conflict is never going away. So the skill set that you need in this modern world is not really your technology skills. It's your influence and political savviness and stakeholder management and all of those soft skills. This is the reality of what, in my mind anyways, what CIO-ship is about now.
Maybe within the guardrails, you can't experiment as much as you would like, but at least for us, and I think this is true across the financial services landscape or any regulatory or compliance landscape, those guardrails need to be in place. And I always say to the teams, let me build you the apartment building. Whatever you do in your own apartment is up to you. But we will provide the security. We will provide the outside walls. Feel free to experiment within the bounds of this. There just are certain lines you can't cross. And that's the balance we continue to struggle to find that you alluded to, Paul, is how do you let the teams innovate? How do you look for new things while still managing? I don't even talk about cost so much. For me, security is paramount in the end. And that necessarily influences some of that innovation culture.
I think where the innovation is really accelerated is when it's driven by business and when business wants it and they're ahead of you in trying it and now you need to bring them back to work within the guardrail. That's where you actually can get the proper budgeting around it and acceleration. So from my experience, every time I have business as stakeholders who I educate more and I allow them to play with things, they are the champions and the ambassadors for those innovations. And they make innovations in the edge and we try to scale it or look it up and say, how does that work for others? So it has to be business driven. It has to be that way.
It's really, simplicity. If you look at the cybersecurity area, it's basic things that typically will be your weakest point: vulnerability management, the controls that they're not net new controls. It's just performing them consistently and across your asset suite. Simplicity, all the variances that you have make it more complex to catch things or implement. And then I think the innovation part is, leverage those who do it well, right? Like if you have a vendor who does something leading edge, if they are offering cloud services, instead of maybe recreating it yourself, leverage the edge vendors that can provide those services, because I don't think many of our companies can keep up with all of the technical advancement. How do you manage your privileged accounts? We just can't, we don't have the technology to do those things. So I think there's a lot of like, it's simplicity, standardization, and then like leverage innovation where there's availability and expertise in that domain.
The challenge I have is, how do you put the guardrails around it and avoid shadow IT? Because you'll get the creative business guys who come across a need, they'll use their credit card, they'll set up an instance in AWS or wherever they choose to do it, and potentially they can go and do damage. Nothing wrong with the need they've got. They're not being addressed clearly by the main IT department. But for me, it's how do you strike that balance and ensure that you have got the right sort of guardrails in place to prevent damage being done, but to not stifle the innovation that you've got from some of those individuals.
I think that's the biggest challenge. But if you pair up with them as opposed to separate from them, you have a better, chance of success in leveraging them and their knowledge of why they actually want this, versus, no, this is not an enterprise tool. I'm not gonna even entertain it.
Oh, I could talk more about this like later in the evening, but we actually have evolved our agile model quite a few iterations. In the last 2 years, we moved to a flavor we call product-centric agile. And there's no the business or tech. It's actually, here's a product and engineering team. There's two in a box, there's equal weighting in the voices in the group. I think it's where Chris was going, some of the cross-functional bits, but it's shared objectives for the team from day one to post-launch. And how they are going to solve things is a joint exercise, joint exploration to try and make sure that, you're getting a good product and customer view of what needs to be solved. But the engineering team is also there at day zero as well and providing their input on what they think could be more feasible or easier to implement and different ideas that we could reuse from other parts of our architecture. I think that's how you can get some of the speed, but maintain some of those balances. And it changes your it's a change of operating model, it's a change of structure, change of funding model. Like there's a lot of changes, but the culture starts to work when you can align some of those pieces.
One cool thing that I think we're doing is we actually have a hackathon, which is a cross-company hackathon sponsored by the CEO, right? And along with the hackathon, basically there are different groups of teams that form business society, cross-functional teams, right? That actually worked on like a few projects, and at the end, they got that there will be a prize, for the best solution that was put forward. But I find that I think this is our second year that we have been doing it, and it is along with that is a campaign that to upskills our resources, teach them how to use the AI tools, cloud app technologies, right? So and I think it's a good way in terms of being seen as not an IT thing, right? It's a business-driven, product-centric, right? But also providing the tools and skills and teaching them the guardrail on, how to implement innovative solutions. Right?
And if you think of the whole AI era, there is a ton of money that executives are setting aside to innovate and solve these problems and possibly become more efficient and effective. We have many Gen AI agile pods, the business folks and the engineers coming together to think of patterns and see what we can do. So there's no shortage of money to innovate, assuming it's, the executive can control somewhat or influence where we're going to innovate and how, or where in their business problems are we going to help solve. Whereas if you do it in a vacuum, then forget it. The backs go up, so you just probably wasted your time. But then there's also innovation for CAPREIT. So how do we make our own execution faster and create opportunities to innovate there? So, it's works. So I agree, how do you balance the cost and effort to innovate?
Right? So we set up a Shark Tank, groups of business and IT people around specific, what problem we're trying to solve, presenting to the sharks, which was a subset of the C-suite, the IT guy and the R&D guy and so forth. And the winner got $50,000 worth of funding. Right? right, to take their ideas forward. Mag is a very decentralized company, and so $50,000 is a lot of money. It was spectacularly popular. People would compete just to present, right? Because we could only do whatever 10 teams or something. It was really, really a lot of fun.
It's interesting to hear how everyone else sees it. In government, it can be very difficult to make an innovation-based case, or at least that's my experience thus far. But we've been where we've found most success is in leveraging compliance or some other regulatory imperative or a privacy gap or some other risk-based gap as an opportunity for us to innovate. Because there's always choices that you have in how you're going to solve a particular problem. So knowing what is kind of coming and unavoidable, and then tying that back to what does the company want to actually achieve, and can we actually link those two together? I'd say that's where, now there are probably, I'd say this is a cultural change for us in leadership, so that it's taken me probably some time to learn that tactic of how to do that, and now training up people throughout the company, business and IT, and also our vendors to help us with that, right? Because they will tend to know what are the opportunities, and we tend to know what's unavoidable. And so trying to figure out how to marry those two to actually be able to move something forward. Yeah, that's how risk-based business cases in public sector tend to have a lot of weight. So that's how we get at the innovation.